if you could generate enough real world evidence, could it actually provide updates to indications or update a medicine's SPC going forward? And I think there's definitely opportunities in that area. I think we need to start exploring them more, and certainly the base that we're setting in the guidance that we're producing is to kind of show this is the level of robustness that you need to achieve as you go forward.
Welcome to the new HBW Insight Over-the-Counter podcast with me, David Ridley, Senior Editor, Europe. In this new podcast, I'll be talking to industry figures and experts about new trends and issues emerging in the global consumer healthcare market. In this special edition of Over the Counter, I'll be speaking to Michelle Riddles, Chief Executive Officer of the UK Consumer Healthcare Industry Association, PAGB. Michelle has over 20 years of experience working in the pharmaceutical sector, most of them in OTC. Before becoming PAGB CEO last March, just as the pandemic hit the UK, she worked for Pfizer on some of the biggest RX to OTC switches in recent British history, for example Nexium Control and Viagra Connect. Ahead of the PAGB's Digital Week, which runs from the 5th to the 9th of July, for which HBW Insight is media partner, we'll discuss the challenges and opportunities of digitalisation for both industry and consumers. In this wide-ranging interview, we dig deeper into the rise of e-commerce, the issues that online advertising bring for medicines, digital health apps and real-world evidence. Don't forget to sign up for Digital Week. You can find the details of how to do that on the HBW Insight page for this podcast episode and on the PAGB website, and watch out for our daily coverage.
How are you, David?
I'm all right, thanks. How are you, Michelle?
Yeah, not so bad, thank you. I've had a little bit of a hectic morning, as probably knows, with children, computer failures, printer failures, that kind of thing. But I'm all good now. My husband just brought me a cup of tea, so I'm feeling a little bit more like, okay.
Oh, yeah, good.
So
yeah, it can be a bit mad, can't it? I mean,
yes.
So how are you set for Digital Week?
Yes, very much so. We're frantically doing lots of work and lots of PR and stuff at the moment, but I think we're in a pretty good position, actually. I think we're doing pretty well.
It's a jam-packed schedule, isn't it?
It is, and we started to prepare a long time in advance, to be honest. So I think we're in a good position and just finalising everything at the moment. So yeah,
we're really excited about it. We're looking forward to all the panels. So thanks for being up for doing it. The podcast, this is our third one in this format. Anyway, me and Tom have done a few, but in this format where I'm interviewing external people, and it's a great opportunity to talk about digital with the event coming up, and we can talk a bit more about that. I think at the end we'll just quickly, run through what people can look forward to, how they can register if they haven't already.
Yes.
And just mention that HBW will be covering it as media partners.
Yeah.
So first thing I was interested in, quite a general question really. What is self-care? Just to kind of set up the more specific question of what is digital self-care.
Yeah. Okay. Well, PAGB defines self-care as actions people take for themselves and their families. So that's the kind of thing where you would promote and maintain good health, promote and maintain well-being, and also take care of their self-treatable conditions. And it's important from our side to realise that self-care isn't no care. It's about caring in a positive way, and that may involve support and advice from others, such as expert pharmacy teams. And self-care in itself is really can be described as a continuum, and you may have seen the continuum diagram on our website, but it looks from promoting everyday well-being, so things like where you may take a vitamin to help your well-being, all the way through, including treating self-treatable conditions and to the management of long-term conditions and recovery after trauma. So it covers a really wide range of areas, but the piece where we really focus on is treating those self-treatable conditions and helping maintain the wellness and well-being.
And so how does digital fit into that? What would you say is digital self-care, if it's different at all?
Well, I think digital supports the self-care. So it's actually one way of supporting people to manage their own healthcare across the continuum. And there's a lot of ways that digital can do that, from apps, from having greater information available online. And last year, PAGB did an audit of the NHS digital offering, and was really looking to see how or what the possibilities were that technology could support self-care. So one of the pieces was that felt that in NHS England that it would be important to develop a self-care section on the NHS app and the NHS website, which people could always go to and navigate to, that had fact sheets and build on improving people's understanding of self-care, but also go to a place which was trusted, because obviously the NHS websites are trusted and valuable information, and allow people to know what to do without necessarily having to contact the doctor. So, they're self-caring and being guided by the information in there. But it can also range, a little bit wider as well, looking at the opportunity of exploring apps and wearables, because again, they can help support greater self-care. And how could they be used to encourage general well-being and fitness kind of going forward as well? So there's lots of different areas within digital that kind of impact on that self-care agenda.
Yeah, and like you say, that's a good point about the apps and the wearables that are coming out now. I mean, from my point of view, it seems that industry has been talking about digital for quite a long time, but something seems to have changed recently, where you're now seeing some really concrete examples, like actual products that are definite consumer healthcare products and linked to like brands. So you mentioned wearables. GSK brought out the Volta and knee brace, and then you've got the J&J Quick Miss Smart Track app, well, the app and the NRT product. So you've got some like really kind of high profile, big brand interventions into this area. So, I mean, what do you think has changed over the last year or so that has accelerated this?
Well, I think, technology always moves very fast, and, you've got to be able to kind of keep up with the technology and what's available out there. But obviously, innovation, especially when it's involving medicines, does take time, and you've got the regulations that you need to work within to ensure that you're meeting all the requirements. And at the moment, the regulations are, from a time where technology wasn't as fast paced and, perhaps as innovative. And, back in 2001, where, the medicines was the last medicines legislation change, digital and the whole smartphones weren't even existing then. So the concept of how you kind of tally them together isn't really there in the legislation. So what you've got to kind of, the companies have got to ensure that they're navigating all of this correctly, and that does take time. And innovation, you can have the ideas, but to get that all working in a good way for medicines is a little bit harder. And I think also there's now been consumers are kind of increasingly ready and willing to embrace digital technology as well. Previously, you know, it's been a while, and Fitbits and things have really helped people have more confidence with apps that are linked to kind of consumer healthcare products. So it's opened up the opportunities a little bit more, you know, and with the Nicorette Quick Mist product, you know, the behavioural program that's linked to it is really interesting and really innovative. So, and you know, that's great, and obviously we'd love to see more of that. And actually, you know, in our digital week, we've actually got the Nicorette team talking about their Quick Mist Smart Track product as part of our apps day. So again, talking a little bit about what the product does and how they got to there.
Yeah, it is a really interesting product. I've done like a series of interviews with various members of the Nicorette team, kind of really diving into that product, because there's a lot to extract from that. So yeah, anyone that's interested in that should check out the articles on HBW as well. I mean, yeah, you're pointing there to when you talk about regulation and you know the technology moving faster than the regulation does. That seems to be like that points to a really key role for organisations like PAGB. Maybe this is a good opportunity for you to just briefly talk about the work you've been doing, because PAGB have done a lot of work on this over the last year, haven't you?
Yeah, I mean, we've been doing an awful lot of work with regards to digital and, you know, trying to map out what you can and can't do in all different areas of the spectrum in terms of products. So we've been looking at apps and medical devices, and you know what the distinction is between them and when an app becomes a medical device. And so we're producing guidance that's come out on that, which again we're sharing in the apps and medical device section at the Digital Week. But we've also been, you know, looking wider at other areas for products that get impacted by digital as well, including like real world evidence and you know, e-commerce, and also actually social media. And the impact of social media in terms of even advertising some of your products. And so we're trying to really enable our members to fully understand, and I think we kind of tried to map what you can do to ensure that you're compliant in this ever-changing area. And you know, now we've mapped it out, we can then continue to update that as changes happen, but also look and see where we may want to influence and understand more, and kind of get involved in all of those different areas as we move forward.
Yeah, and we're just going to touch on some of those as well, I think, in this podcast. But obviously, they'll be explored in more detail in the Digital Week. But I think, you know, one of the things that has definitely changed is, you know, the coronavirus pandemic, or in terms of a factor that's made a difference. And we can see some of the specific effects that's had in terms of digital. So, I mean, obviously, people have been using digital technology more because they've been more reliant on kind of mediated forms of shopping and communication. Yeah. But I think, you know, one of the most obvious things we've written about is the boom in e-commerce.
Yeah.
So what challenges does that bring for industry and for consumers from PAGB's point of view?
Yeah, I think it definitely does bring some challenges, but I do think there are some opportunities as well there. I think, you know, one of the things that it's made companies do is that really understand that if they weren't really on e-commerce platforms beforehand, that they really need to get up to speed and get there. And you know, it is harder in a regulated industry like ourselves for medicines to know exactly what you can and can't do. It's not like selling a general product, because not only have you got the medicines regulations kind of kicking in, you know, when things are on e-commerce platforms, there's also potential advertising. And of course, as you're probably aware, PAGB has to approve advertising to consumers for for medicinal products. So it starts getting quite complicated as to what is advertising and what isn't advertising. So it's quite a hard path to navigate. And, some of the bigger companies may have already had, great resource and digital strategy in place, but some of our more medium to smaller members may not have really been in that space and have suddenly had to, upskill themselves and learn much more about that. And again, that's kind of where we've also started, as part of the digital work that we did, look at how what are the requirements for e-commerce. And ironically, we started our digital program way before COVID actually started and before there was this big uptake. But one of the things when I put the strategy together was that e-commerce was up and coming then. Obviously, it's been expedited as a result of the lockdown, but it's making sure that people also understand not just the advertising, but their responsibilities, the utilization of, when they're on a marketplace, what if they're outsourcing parts of the work to Amazon or other third-party fulfillment things, and also just simply what are their responsibilities in supply and delivery, and also, if someone actually is ordering your product that you've got in the UK from abroad, are you allowed to sell it? So there's certainly a lot of knowledge gap, and again, that's one of the things that we're trying to overcome and help with the e-commerce work that we've done. I think, the mentioning like the online selling, I think from a consumer's perspective, they want to make sure that the products that they are getting are the correct ones. And, so I think they've got much wider access for medicines, but one, they want to make sure that the products they're getting is the right, correct product. But I think also a challenge is that, they don't necessarily have pharmacy interactions with a pharmacist for the products that are only available from a pharmacist, and I think that's kind of something that still remains a challenge for the e-commerce section, is that, you can have pharmacists overseeing the sale from an e-commerce perspective, but if people have got kind of questions, it's perhaps not quite as easy to have that type of interaction as you would have if you walked into your bricks and mortar shop, on your high street or in your village. So I think that's some of the challenges. But I think, from an opportunity perspective, as I said, for consumers, there is, it opens up access to, everything that's available, and it gets delivered to your door, which is obviously a very big convenience factor. And I think for members and our companies, again, they get potentially, by going on these platforms, although they may not have necessarily, it's been expedited, that they do actually get a larger audience and potential, selling to a much wider audience themselves as well.
Yeah, I think, what you're pointing to there is just how complex just even one part of the digital picture is. I mean, just e-commerce, brings up all of these issues, and we're just kind of in the middle of them at the moment, aren't we? But I think you make some really important points about, I think one of the problems we've seen this in during the pandemic is the kind of fake medicines that people are selling online, and there's no matter how much organisations and government agencies crack down on these things, and they really are, they're popping up all the time. So I think, one of the challenges is helping consumers to be able to identify, reputable and non-reputable sellers. But then, like you say, also the role that pharmacists traditionally played in helping consumers to self-care responsibly, also, that needs to be there as well. And there are ways to do that. There are companies that are doing really interesting things with, like algorithmic kind of advice and online forms of communication with healthcare professionals. So yeah, I mean, it all kind of points to the role of digital literacy. How important would you say that is?
I think it definitely is important, and you want to ensure that the information that the consumers get is secure and it isn't, misinformation, which, is obviously a concern. And I mentioned earlier, people going to the NHS because that's a trusted site. And I think, that's really important, and why we're advocating that places like the NHS have, information that is correct on there, and an easy signposting that is trusted going forward. In our digital audit for self-care last year, we looked at that offering, and obviously that was one of the conclusions. We've just done another kind of new self-care survey, which asked more than 2,000 people about how they access health services, including their use of online health information. And we're publishing the results later this month. Although kind of talking of Digital Week, we are previewing some of that in some of the self-care sessions. So I can't really divulge any findings in detail at the moment. But what I can say is there's some interesting statistics about the way people look for health information online, and fears that they have about what information they come across is reliable. So, as you say, digital literacy is important, and knowing what is trusted is definitely, key, I think, in helping facilitate self-care going forward.
But I think also it's important to recognise that consumers are maybe more discerning than we think. We don't want to assume that it's a very low bar. I mean, you've got some evidence there, obviously, you're going to reveal, but maybe also there's a kind of positive view where consumers have maybe gotten a lot better at it over the last 12 months as well, having spent a lot of time online. What do you think? Do you think they're getting better?
I think that's a fair assumption to make. I think, COVID and the misinformation that has been out around that, has been, highlighted in the news. You see it on Facebook, and, lots of different things have come up over the last year, which I think have made people more aware that not everything that you read online is true. And so I think, that has kind of opened people's eyes a little bit to the fact that, not everything is correct, and that therefore, when warnings come up, I think it's kind of on Facebook and Twitter that people kind of say this may not be correct information. It's making people definitely become more savvy in checking facts and information. And I think, that can only be positive for the self-care industry, in making sure that they are looking at reputable sources of information to educate themselves on how to use products properly, but not even necessarily using the products themselves, but just getting the information that they need. Yeah,
I've seen that. I think that's really positive that the companies that are hosting this kind of information, like Facebook and Twitter, etc., have taken a bit more responsibility in helping people to be able to become a bit more critical and do some fact checking. I think that's really good. I think, just returning to the advertising issue, I don't know. It seems that this is maybe part of the complexity, is that because of the rapid speed of technological change, I think a lot of companies, it's a complicated, like you say, it's a complicated system to navigate, and maybe some companies don't quite understand, the extent to which everything that you put in the world and anywhere is a form of advertising. So you get stuff on websites, for example, with CBD, you'll get companies like quoting consumer feedback on, the health benefits of CBD, and as far as I understand, that can be considered a form of advertising. So that's one of the things that's one of the roles that this kind of education, that PAGB are undertaking, can really help with. But then there's also the factors like influencers. And this is I think one of the things that you'll be looking at, and it's definitely come up quite a lot. Having people promoting your products online on social media, and how far that's subject to existing advertising guidelines. I imagine it's very difficult to navigate all this for a company.
Yeah, and definitely we've got a whole section on social media in Digital Week, and there's already guidance available on our website for members on social media as a result of the working group and all the work that's gone into it. But it is complicated, and I think, you know, social media influence is kind of very grey, because when does someone who is just doing something on the internet actually then become an influencer, and then what does that mean in itself as you go forward? I think it's quite difficult for medicines, because you're not allowed celebrity endorsement of a medicine, and therefore that links into the influencer piece, because if you are an influencer, you almost become by default a celebrity within that area. So therefore you have to be very careful how you interact with people, especially with medicines, going forward, because the whole point of the legislation behind it is that you don't want to use somebody who is a celebrity or an influencer to promote medicines, and that's come around from, years and years ago, where you had kind of celebrity endorsement, which, just isn't acceptable here in the UK.
Yeah, again, it just highlights how complex this is, and I think one of the extra complexities that already existed in the sector is these borderline cases between medicines and healthcare products, food supplements, and then of course medical devices, apps, where the line is. But what might be okay, like with food or with cosmetics, is not okay with medicines.
Yeah.
And there are all these products or product categories that kind of bridge those lines, don't they? And that makes it even more difficult to navigate.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's one of the things that we look at, because when you do have a brand that is in multiple categories, so it can include a medicine, a device, and a food supplement, or a cosmetic that you mentioned, it does make it a lot harder. And how do you ensure that you're not overstepping the mark on the medicines piece, but because you are allowed to use influencers with devices and food supplements, how do you navigate that situation? And again, that's one of the things that we look at in the social media guidance, that we go forward with.
And yeah, so this leads me to a couple of thorny, complicated questions, but yeah, it points to this something that I'm quite interested in, that seems to be a strand of work for regulators at the moment.
Yeah.
But what the difference is between a healthcare app and a medical device. I mean, yeah, we can't obviously get into the details. That's a very complicated question, but yeah, I suppose is there anything you can say about that, and just why is it important? Like, why is that something that needs to be sorted out?
Yeah, so I mean, to a lot of people using any of the apps, they may not know that they're an app or a medical device. So actually, there isn't always a perceptible difference to the end user, which in a way is one of the complicating factors about it. Or, I mean, what it really comes down to is, when looking at the difference between the two, is kind of the perceived use and claims relating to that app or the device, and then how that app or device manages data that is generated. So from a technical point of view, the key difference between a healthcare app and a medical device is its intended purpose. So that's kind of how the product is presented, and then the perception that the consumer has on it. So in a very top line overview, if an application's purpose is intended to diagnose, monitor, or alleviate a disease, it falls under a medical device definition, and therefore should be regulated accordingly. But there are a lot of kind of factors that make it not quite so black and white in that. But what's important is that you want people to have trust in what's out there. And I think there's a difference between having a device which is tracking your steps or monitoring your heartbeat and giving you that kind of information, to a kind of app that is then telling you, well, we're looking at that heartbeat and we can tell you that you've got an arrhythmia. Now, if it's doing that, it's kind of giving you a medical diagnosis. And, you know, it's right that if something is doing that, that the level of scrutiny and validation of all the information behind that, which is what would make it a medical device, is looked at properly to ensure that it's making a true and accurate interpretation stroke diagnosis. And therefore a lot of validation needs to be done, and you have to do an awful lot of work behind the scenes making sure that that data is analysed and stored and interpreted correctly. Whereas if you're just using an app that is monitoring your heart rate and is just saying, oh, you're 63 beats per minute, the amount of validation and work needed behind that is very different. And all you're doing is saying your heart is beating at 63 beats per minute. You are not making any interpretation of that, which therefore means that it can just be an app. Now, both can be used, and is interesting for people to know, but you're not making any assumptions based on that data. And I think as soon as you do start making assumptions and you do start going down the medical route, you as a consumer would obviously want to be really sure that the data and the information that you're being given is correct going forward, which is why it's so important that then that becomes a medical device.
I think that's a brilliant explanation. Thanks, Michelle. It's really, just from looking at it, I know it's very difficult to kind of pick apart, and it's a work in progress, like I said. But yeah, so thanks for that. And then the final kind of I suppose trend, if you like, within this kind of digital self-care area, and the industry is talking a lot about, and I think the wider pharmaceutical industry has been talking about it maybe longer, but consumer healthcare starting to see the potential in it as well, is real world data and real world evidence, and the potential for generating evidence for switches or new health claims and stuff like that. So what do you see is the potential there?
I think it's got great potential, and as you've said, it has been being used in the wider pharma industry for kind of a lot longer. What we're trying to do is put some definitions out there of what that can mean for OTC products, because the difference for us, and there are differences between OTC and pharma, is that obviously people are using these products in a real world environment, often without any clinical intervention or oversight at all. And therefore, it's really interesting to find out what that can mean going forward, and how can you find out information that's happening when people are using the products at home in that environment themselves. And therefore, what data can that then produce to help support different aspects of product life cycle? And I think we've started seeing it definitely at PAGB already, where real world evidence studies have started being used for advertising claims and things like that, and there's already examples out there of where that's happened, and we're sharing some of those in the real world evidence session in Digital Week. I think what we're also trying to do is really put a stake in the ground to say what would form a robust example of real world data and real world evidence. So in our guidance that we've produced, we are giving examples of different types of studies and information that we think is important to ensure that the data that you get out of any study that you do is robust enough to support an evidence for changes both in the product life cycle, but in the advertising. And we see that there, although it hasn't necessarily been used yet in all different aspects of a product life cycle, I myself have had personal experiences of it being used in switches. And I think that's a very interesting area where it can be further utilised. But, an ultimate aim that I would like to see is that if you could generate enough real world evidence, could it actually provide updates to indications or update a medicine's SPC going forward? And I think there's definitely opportunities in that area. I think we need to start exploring them more. And certainly the base that we're setting in the guidance that we're producing is to kind of show this is the level of robustness that you need to achieve as you go forward. I think it's also interesting to look at what's being done already, and we do routinely in all pharma at the moment user testing of patient information leaflets, and when you actually look at what that consists of, I would argue that that is a type of real world evidence. You're actually out there talking to 20 individuals and asking whether they can find and understand information in a patient information leaflet, and you're doing that via an interview mechanism. Now, obviously that's not digital, although I know they had to go digital and do that online through COVID, but that is producing data which is then shaping what comes out and what gets approved. And I think there's a really exciting opportunity to further develop things like that and get them agreed and utilised within the regulatory system going forward, to enable wider product life cycle applications of the real world evidence.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point there, where it's one of those buzzwords that you forget what it also can mean. And I think real world evidence has been used for a long time, in non-digital forms. So it's important to remember that. But I suppose also real world evidence in the way that it's been used within conversations about digital brings us right back to the beginning, where we talked about like apps and wearables. And I think, like you say, in the OTC space, there's this whole world of use which is outside, happens after the approval. Outside pharmacies a lot of the time when you have GSL products, for example.
Exactly.
So having these tools to generate the data to find out what's going on there is going to be really important, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that's true, but I also think now we have digital kind of forums online. You also are able to actually do research as well. So you've obviously got the generating data which can support things, but if you're also wanting to find out and do more research on also what people have done in the past, or how they've acted, or how they've utilised it, having digital platforms with questions on there also actually increases the ability to get feedback from consumers and patients, which may have happened in a more face-to-face way previously. You can also get much larger numbers and start generating more information just through the facilitation of digital use and online use of questionnaires and data, and really churn and get much more information out of it in that way as well.
So I mean, hopefully we've generated a bit of excitement for the Digital Week just by talking about these issues and pointing to the sessions. But I don't know if you just want to just briefly point the listeners towards the event, how they can sign up, say a bit more about what they can expect.
Yeah, so that's great. You can sign up on the PAGB's website, which is pagb.co.uk, and we've got all the information on there about each daily session and what's in it. What we've done is we had 5 work streams originally that we developed our strategy in, and we've allocated each work stream to one day. So you can either go in and buy a ticket for the whole day and learn about the specific area, like e-commerce, for example, that you might be interested in, or you can buy a week ticket and look at all of the content. We've got opening plenary from Google, and we've got 2 speakers from Google coming along telling us how they see how digital can help the future of healthcare. And we've got a closing plenary from IQVIA as well, which is kind of summing up where we're at and kind of what the future looks like as well. So we've got all the different topics and two exciting keynote speeches in there. And obviously, David and his team at HBW, or our media partners, are going to be going along to each session and hopefully summarising and providing updates of what we've done each day as we move forward.
Yeah, and we're really excited about that. And we'll put on with the story when we publish the podcast on the HBW website, we'll also just put a link to the sign up page and everything there as well, so it's easy to access from the page. And like Michelle says, we'll be covering it, doing daily summaries, which will be available on HBW. But also, I think you're going to distribute that as well, Michelle, through the PAGB guest email list.
Yes, that's my understanding.
Brilliant. Well, yeah, thanks for that. I think that was a brilliant discussion. So much detail. I mean, it's so great to have such a knowledgeable CEO of our local Consumer Healthcare Industry Association, and it's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you very much, David.
Thanks for listening to Over the Counter. Watch out for new episodes in the future on the HBW Insight website, on our LinkedIn and Twitter pages, and on SoundCloud. See you soon.